Councillors, this evening the Chair of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee is an apology because of illness. As Manager of Governance and Legal, I call for nominations for the position of Temporary Chairperson. Councillor Watson.
I nominate Councillor Gary Thompson as the previous past Chair of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee.
Thank you. Councillor Addis.
Happy to second. Thank you. Councillor
Thompson, do you accept the nomination? Councillors, are there any objections or other nominations? Councillor Thompson, please take the chair.
Welcome everyone to tonight's meeting of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee. Before we commence the meeting, I request that all mobile phones are turned to silent or switched off completely. Thank you. My name is Councillor Gary Thompson and I'm the temporary chair for this evening's committee meeting. I'll start by introducing my fellow councillors. Seated the closest to me, our Mayor wearing the mask, Councillor Felicity Sinfield, followed by Councillor Cynthia Watson, Councillor Wes Galt, Councillor Di Gillies, and opposite Councillor Gillies, Councillor Lisa Hollingsworth, our Deputy Mayor, adjacent to our Deputy Mayor, Councillor Jane Addis, and closest to me, Councillor Victor Franco. I acknowledge our Manager of Governance and Legal, Mr Brian Wee, is seated to my left, immediately to your right, and our Manager of Planning and Placemaking, Mr David Cohen, is situated to my right. There are other officers in attendance tonight and they'll be introduced as they present their reports. The Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting is being live streamed on the Council YouTube to enable public viewing of the proceedings. The meeting is also being recorded and will be made available on the Council YouTube as soon as practically possible after the meeting. The purpose of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee is to deal with issues under the Planning and Environment Act and the Building Act. This committee has delegated authority to make decisions on behalf of Council. For those of you presenting this evening, when it comes to the agenda item, it'll be firstly introduced by a Council officer. I will then call you up one by one to come forward to sit at the head of the horseshoe table to address the committee. If you're making a submission, please present your viewpoints clearly and concisely on why you either support or oppose the planning application. I'd ask that you don't repeat what earlier speakers have said and keep the submission that you present focused on the relevant issues and points not previously raised. If you're opposed to the planning application, please tell the committee why you disagree and suggest an alternative approach that would satisfy your concerns. Please focus on your concerns rather than matters of history or detail in the officer's report. There is a strict time limit of 3 minutes for each speaker and councillor, and whilst as chair I can vary that, I seldom do. At the 2.5 minute mark, I'll make a sound, which is our little bell, indicating that you've got 30 seconds remaining to complete your presentation. For those in the gallery this evening, I'd like to take this opportunity just to remind you friendly to extend your courtesy and respect to others and to the committee as a whole. This also applies to councillors. This includes remaining quiet whilst others are presenting and addressing the meeting and not disrupting decision-making process of the committee. Turning to apologies, Mr Wee, do we have any apologies this evening?
Through you, Chair, there are 3 apologies this evening. Councillor Park and Councillor Bigger are on leaves of absence, and Councillor Stavru is an apology because of illness.
Thank you, Mr Wee. Item 1, adoption and confirmation of the minutes of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting held on the 4th of September 2023. Councillors, I'm in search of a motion to adopt. Councillor Galt, mover.
As issued, Chair.
Thank you. And seconder, Councillor Gillies.
Thank you, Chair.
Is there any opposition on that? There being none, I'll put that motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. Item 2, declaration of conflict of interest of any councillor or council officer. Are there any conflicts to declare this evening? There being none, thank you again. So move on to our first officer report this evening, item 3.1, the Burundara Housing Strategy, community consultation, outcomes and consideration of the final strategy. This will be introduced by Ms Jessica Donaldson, Principal Strategic Planner. Thank you.
Good evening. Over the last year, the strategic planning team, working collaboratively with teams across council, have undertaken a comprehensive review and updating of the Burundara housing strategy to help plan for our community's future housing needs. Over the next 15 years, Burundara is forecast to add around 28,700 residents and 9,400 dwellings to its neighbourhoods. Our housing strategy helps to manage the provision of housing for the benefit of our current and future community. It's also required as a strategic foundation for any future housing policies and controls in the Burundara planning scheme, such as changing to zoning, local planning policies and planning provisions. The latest data and projections were used to inform our community, to inform who our community is and how they live. It provides insight into current and emerging housing challenges, from protecting heritage and character to sustainability to housing choice and affordability and an ageing population. The community were invited to share their feedback on the draft strategy through an online survey and in-person drop-in sessions. In total, 69 feedback responses were received on the draft strategy. Overall, there was strong support for the three strategic directions proposed in the strategy, these being housing diversity in appropriate locations, housing that is sustainable and achieves design excellence, and housing that meets the needs of all residents now and in the future. We know that protecting and respecting the character of Burundara matters to our community. They also care about high quality, appropriate development with housing size diversity and affordability. Feedback provided by the community has helped identify where further consideration, refinement or actions were needed and has informed the final housing strategy. Officers recommend the Urban Planning Delegated Committee resolve to adopt the final version of the Burundara Housing Strategy. Should the Urban Planning Delegated Committee resolve to adopt the final version of the strategy, officers will begin implementation of the actions identified in the Housing Strategy Action Plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Donaldson. Councillors, we have three presenters this evening, one against, one partially against and one undecided. I'll call forward our three presenters in order. Our first presenter, Jaden Charles Batty, if you can come forward. And following on from Mr Batty, Mr Theo Biller, if you can be ready to come forward. Thank you, Mr Batty. If you can commence with your name, your suburb and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Jaden. I grew up in Hawthorn and I currently live in Kew, and I am here on behalf of myself and also Servants Community Housing. Like many locals who grow up in the area, I'm concerned by the rise in homelessness. Around 30% of people in our constituents who are renters are spending more than 30% of their income on rent, and about 20% of mortgage holders are also experiencing mortgage stress. I recognise that this plan supports more social and affordable housing in our community, and I thank Council for including that. However, I'm concerned that in our efforts to manage the tension between appropriate development and increases of social and affordable housing, that Council's not yet taking as active a role as it could in supporting local appropriate social and affordable housing that's appropriate for our community. Council is the closest level of government to our community. Council knows our community best of all three levels of government. As such, I believe that Council has the best chance to facilitate social and affordable housing that is most appropriate and meets the needs of our community whilst still preserving neighbourhood character. So whilst I'm broadly supportive of the recommendations in this strategy, I would urge Council to please consider particularly around the use of council land for social and affordable housing development, and whether there might be scope within this strategy to put forward the opportunity for council to facilitate consideration of this as a possibility across future years. Whilst I don't advocate for a strong statement within this plan, I'm asking that council would mention the consideration of such uses. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Batty. Good timing on your presentation as well. We do have one question before you return to the gallery, or actually two. Our first question is from Councillor Jane Addis.
Thanks very much, and thanks for coming in. You were keen that council consider using its land. Given that we're already short of open space, and that's critical for our community, this is a genuine question. How would you see us balancing that? Because in a sense, you're suggesting we bring more people in when we're struggling to provide the open space we believe the community needs for health and well-being.
Thank you, Councillor. In the strategy that's currently being proposed, that's a strong recognition that the population of Burundai will increase, and the consultation that's been put forward also supports more inclusion of medium and higher density housing. Whilst of course we need to be cautious at times with how far we go in that and finding the right balance for our community between low, medium and high density housing, I believe that there will have to be considerations, regardless of whether it's social and affordable housing or other types of housing, about ensuring that our community can sustain and provide equitable access to the great parts that are within our community. There may be opportunities for council to consider existing or future developments that continue to facilitate both open space and development. For example, there are developments such as the Kew Library or alternatively of sports and recreation centres or other areas that may be possible to explore the option, for example, higher density or higher building upon public assets that doesn't detract from the capacity for council to provide community spaces for our whole community, but also facilitate that social and affordable housing, particularly in the most appropriate way for each development. And that's where my recommendation to the strategy is about exploring that when there's council development of council assets, not a blanket sort of inclusion.
Thank you, Councillor Addis. Does that answer your question?
Not entirely, but I'm happy with the answer.
You can take
I'll
the
take it as
principle.
answered. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Councillor Franco.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation. The first part of your presentation, you started by addressing the tensions that can occur between appropriate development or more intense development and social housing. I was wondering if in that you were specifically alluding to council's position or stance in relation to the Bill Street and the Ashburton Public Housing, in particular council's opposition to those developments, that they will deliver significant public housing. I don't know if that was where you were going with that, or whether your sole focus was the latter point about the use of public land. Could you clarify?
Not entirely the first point. Yes, there are potential developments at Bill Street in Ashburton, but I suppose the scope of my presentation is not limited to those two sites, but rather recognising that because council is the closest level of government to community, council has the best understanding of what is appropriate for our community. And so when considering other developments even beyond those, such as Bill Street or Ashburton, which has previously been used for social and or affordable housing to varying degrees of success, looking at that as from a model perspective in terms of safety and community amenity, council actually is the best placed level of government to facilitate and to look at options to include appropriate social and affordable housing. That's not a comment specifically on whether Bill Street or Ashburton are appropriate or inappropriate, but that there is potential scope for council to consider the appropriateness for each development of council-owned assets that it's looking at both now and into the future.
One final question, and your reference to the use of council assets, to be blunt, are you referring to existing open space or potential open space sites, or assets that we have that may have current buildings on them and the like, or both?
I'm particularly looking at assets that might currently have buildings on them. For example, to bring up Ashburton, there are current buildings there, although there's vacant buildings as well, particularly on some state government land as well. There may be opportunity to look at whether existing buildings where there's going to be redevelopment opportunities where council can consider the use and potentially look at feasibility studies of considering the use of social and affordable housing in addition to public spaces on those sites. Now, council may at some point decide that it wishes to explore the use of social and affordable and housing on spaces that are currently public spaces or outdoor spaces. That's not my sole or priority care. It's that in every development, council should be exploring the best use of that site, and in some sites there may be opportunity for a mix. I'm particularly thinking though where there's current buildings.
Can I ask one very quick last question? Do you think that what you're proposing is ruled out by our current plan rather than not ruled in?
In the earlier version of the housing strategy, it was explicitly ruled out, even though there are actually council assets that are being used as social and affordable housing. So there's a point of contention or concern there that there's actually a conflict within the existing strategy. In the more recent updated version of the strategy, it's not explicitly ruled out. However, in the response that's provided to Servants Community Housing submission in the papers that are presented today, there's a position there that's quite firmly suggesting that that is not council's position to explore that development on council-owned land.
So, thank you, Councillor Franco. We might put that to matters arising for the officers to address as well. Thank you, Mr. Batty. Doesn't appear to be any further lights on, so thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
You may return to the gallery. Thank you. Mr. Theo Biller, if you can come forward, thank you. Good evening, Mr. Biller.
Mr. Chairman, Councillor,
You can commence with your-
CEO, thank you very much for allowing me to address this meeting after probably 6 years of silence. So you didn't have anything to criticize here. Anyway, but I respect the right to criticize what I don't understand, not what I do understand. Now, regarding to this plan, number one, I don't dwell on every item. Delegated committee, to me, I cannot digest it. With 23 years of full-time in school, management position, I did not see anywhere that the high management is delegating their duties to the lower level and make them eventually responsible. But I reserve the right to agree and not to disagree, but I don't see it. You practically, with directors and God save us, we have 11 councillors, 2 mayors, and we're still pushing things backwards. But I don't see your interaction or your involvement on this level with this delegated committee. Regarding strategy, everyone can define the strategy in various forms and shapes. But what we do from the federal government, state, local authorities, we put the horses behind the carriage. Otherwise, we have a strategy, so, we increase the population of this country to so much. But what do you do? Where do you, and now you bring them in, and then you start to work out, where do I put them in houses, decent houses? What do we do? Do we have enough infrastructure? Water, gosh, the nature resolved that problem because there's plenty of water in Australia, so it will be something in Melbourne. But water, gas, everywhere they start now to repair the infrastructure. So what is the strategy? Next, every new building, even on my street, which is not a big one, about 45 numbers, all the new houses has artificial grass and cement everywhere, no one tree. So I don't see where the strategy is. Increasing the cement and artificial grass will not save our planet, if you like. And
15 seconds, Mr. Biller.
sorry, yes, 30 seconds, is it?
15.
Full time.
15 seconds. Now down.
Okay, so I would appreciate if the so-called committee to have, I don't know, more involvement from the strategy, from the manager and the councillors, because that's what we pay them for. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr Biller. Councillors, any questions for Mr Biller? There appears to be none, so thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, it was very interesting then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our last presenter on this item is Miss Robin Kelly, if you can come forward. Good evening, Miss Kelly. If we can just commence with your name and your suburb and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Robin Kelly. I'm at the corner of Whitehorse Road and Kirreep Road, number 2A, Baldwin. And I would like to talk about this subject. Can I commence now? Right. You mentioned before, one of the speakers mentioned before about Markham Avenue, Ashburton. So a lot of you will know that I did have my Robin Hood Antiques for 50 years, nearly 50 years, in Canterbury Road, Canterbury, opposite the station. The building is still there, heritage protected. I had so many people come in from that had units belonging to the Canterbury Centre, Canterbury Welfare, that was established and approved by Hamer and Robert Menzies in the 1950s. A lot of these ladies would come in and tell me about their wonderful units nearby, where they would pay between $80 and $120 a week rent. And they didn't have anywhere to live. They came from all over Melbourne. They would come in to buy books from me and things from me and tell me their stories and invite me to their units. After a while, I started to go in there in the last 10 years when I was having my operations and things. I'd go into Canterbury, now taken over by Bass Care in 1998. But established all those years by people that had the opportunity shop, raffles, all kinds of things that raised nursing home, Meals on Wheels, everything. Absolutely wonderful, and wonderful meals 7 days a week. Now, then in the last 8 years, the units started to deplete and not have any occupants. And the ladies would come up and say they were alarmed about this, they were worried about this. So there's units all over Burundara belonging to Burundara Aged Social Services.
Miss Kelly, I'm just going to pause you there. You've got 1.5 minutes left and we haven't heard from you with regard to this policy. Maybe if you can use your last 1.5 minutes to inform councillors.
I'm just wanting to alert councillors to the fact of most of these units are sitting empty, and I feel that there's soon going to be high-rise established, and I want it to be part social housing in memory of the Canterbury welfare of all the people in the book called The Turning Wheel that was issued on takeover in 1998. I have plenty of copies. So that you'll see we must honour these people and not let Markham Road, Ashburton was nearly tried to be all luxury. So let's do the right thing when these applications come in, that it isn't all luxury housing. It must be social housing to cater for all these homeless people, and people love beautiful old ladies that were my customers. So I would like that to be considered, please. And also what is happening with the empty RSL units on the corner of Keats Street. What is going to happen with those that have been purchased totally by council now? And aren't there needy people that need those as well? So when they're established, please remember social housing.
Thank you, Ms Kelly, for your presentation. Councillors, we do have a question from Councillor Franco.
Which was the site that you say that council purchased?
The RSL on the corner of Keats Street in Canterbury. They provided the land, and the RSL built all the units, and then about 6 years ago, Burundara Council bought all the units. So there's about a couple of people remaining.
Okay.
Prime spot there next to the tennis court and church,
Thank
going
you.
on the left, going into the city, just as you leave Canterbury Gardens, Keats Street.
We might take that question offline. That's not really relevant to tonight, but maybe you can seek that outside of this meeting, Councillor Franco.
Okay.
Any further questions? There appears to be none. Thank you for your presentation this evening, Ms Kelly. We'll turn back, Ms Donaldson, to matters arising. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the presenters. In response to Mr. Batty's presentation, I'd just like to acknowledge that Council does have a homelessness protocol and officer in place. And the housing strategy that is proposed does support social and affordable housing where possible, but it has been a long-held position of Council that Council-owned land is a federal and state government responsibility to provide the social and affordable housing.
Ms Donaldson, sorry for interrupting. I just noticed our CEO's got his light on. Do you wish to add some comments?
Mr Chairman, I'm happy to wait until the officers have finished their comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was the end of my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Donaldson. Now's your time, Mr CEO.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. I just wanted to make sure that the record reflects accurately Council's position in relation to both Markham and Bill Street. Councillor Franco may have inadvertently created the impression Council opposed those developments. I'd like to be clear what it is that Council actually did. The Council was faced with a proposition by the state government to only increase public housing on those sites, in each case by 10% beyond what had been there before. We were very concerned about that and in fact advocated very strongly for a substantial increase in public housing on those sites, and we got many times the 10% the government originally proposed. So Council was very strongly in favour of there being more public housing on both of those sites, and we were successful in our advocacy. The area where Council did have concerns and opposition was in relation to, first of all, Council and community being sidelined in the planning process, and secondly, in relation to the built for response, which Council believed did not adequately reflect the conditions of the local area. So I just want to be clear what it is that Council was in fact opposed to, which was not the provision of public or social housing. We argued for more public housing because that's owned by the state and is enduring, whereas social housing often has a lifespan of not much more than 10 years, whereas provided by a housing association who then turns it over and sells it off. So that's just to make sure the record is clear and a good reflection of Council's position at the time.
Thank you, Mr Storer. We're going to return now to questions from councillors to officers. Councillor Galt, you've got your light on.
Thank you, Chair. In the strategy, it quite clearly says and properly says that it's not Council's position to provide its land, it's the state's responsibility, and we all agree with that. But there may be opportunities in the future, picking up earlier questions being asked, that we could see an opportunity of adding housing to another development we're doing within Burundara, which may well be a council development prima facie. Is there any, thinking that the strategy has to last a while, is there anything in that strategy that would stop us doing that if we so decided to do so in the future?
Through you, Chair. No, the strategy is for 15 years, but we also have an action within the strategy to review the progress of it after 2 years. So there is an opportunity at that point in time.
Thank you, Councillor Galt. There appears to be no further lights on, councillors, so that must exhaust questions. So I'm in search of a motion. Councillor Addis.
I'm happy to move the recommendation up on the screen.
Thank you. The officer's recommendation. And Councillor Galt.
Happy to second.
Thank you. To assist Councillor Addis, is there any opposition on this? There appears to be no opposition. Councillor Addis, do you wish to speak to your motion?
Just briefly, to start by thanking the officers for preparing such a detailed and comprehensive report for us and strategy. Clearly a lot of work went into it, a lot of analysis of what's available currently, what's likely to be needed, and tying that in with the predictions of population growth. It was certainly interesting to read, and I think gives us all some comfort that Burundara should be able to accommodate the projected increase in population without destroying the nature of our suburb, which is something that people are also very keen to see preserved. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Addis. As this motion is unopposed, I'll put this motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors, and thank you, officers. We'll move on to our second item on the agenda this evening, item 3.2, the Heritage Action Plan 2016 review. A consideration of review and commencement of heritage strategy to be introduced by Miss Emily Dixon, Strategic Planner, Heritage. You're not Emily Dixon, are you?
Emil Dixon.
Emil. Thanks, Emil.
No worries. Thank you, Chair. Good evening, councillors, officers and attendees. The Heritage Action Plan was adopted by Council in 2016 to provide a 5-year program for Burundara's heritage-related needs. The 10 highest priority actions under the HAP are the 10 individual suburb-by-suburb heritage gap studies. Collectively, these form the municipal-wide heritage gap study. The last of the suburb-specific gap studies was the Glen Iris Gap Study, which was completed in 2022. On the basis that all high priority and key actions were completed and that the HAP had reached its 5-year mark, the Heritage Action Plan was reviewed. Strategic planning officers undertook the review in consultation with all key units across Council, with actions delegated to them under the Heritage Action Plan. The findings were collated and analysed, and the outcomes published in the Heritage Action Plan Review Report 2023, which is attachment 2 to this agenda item. The review found that all 10 high priority actions were delivered, with over 5,000 additional properties identified and protected under the Heritage Overlay. Over 70% of ongoing or as required actions were commenced, and only 11 actions marked as ongoing or as required were not commenced. A further review into the actions that were not commenced found that a significant number of these actions were not commenced due to the need for the action not arising yet, or due to budgetary or resourcing not being allocated. Many of these uncommenced actions can be integrated into a future action plan. The review of the Heritage Action Plan also found that with the gap study complete, Council should now focus more on the promotion of Burundara's heritage and its engagement with the community on heritage matters. To guide Council's future heritage needs, a heritage strategy that is implemented across Council is needed. A heritage strategy would follow best practice heritage guidelines as established in Heritage Victoria's Municipal Heritage Strategies Guide for Councils. It would address 4 key themes: knowing, protecting, supporting and promoting our heritage. Outstanding actions from the Heritage Action Plan 2016, which are still considered relevant, and any other actions identified through the development of a heritage strategy would be included in an appendix to the new heritage strategy to ensure they are still addressed. A heritage strategy would also align Burundara with best practice by delivering a coordinated municipal approach for wide-ranging heritage work program. The process to develop a heritage strategy would be led by our principal heritage planner in conjunction with key stakeholders, internal and external to Council. Officers recommended the UPDC resolve to endorse the Heritage Action Plan Review Report 2023, contained in Attachment 2, to conclude the Heritage Action Plan 2016, and prepare a Burundara Heritage Strategy to guide Council's future heritage program over the next 10 years, based on Heritage Victoria's Municipal Heritage Strategies Guide for Councils. That concludes our outline of the report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr Dixon, and I do apologise. Councillors, we have 5 presentations this evening, 1 against, 3 for and 1 undecided. I'll call forward our first presenter, Mr Greg Price, if you can come forward. Thank you, Mr Price. If we can commence with your name and your suburb and your 3-minute presentation.
Good evening, councillors. Greg Price from Dent Street in Glen Iris. I'll preface this with saying, please interpret what I say with the intention of creating better policies for the future and not apportioning any blame or history of the past. So, the report was a good analysis of the previous HAP, but the review was limited in scope and methodology. There was no public consultation of the review, and hence it doesn't measure or address what the community wants or needs in terms of heritage now, or whether it's achieving that. It doesn't measure the quality of the work that was undertaken as part of the HAP, essentially, other than we've added 5,000 properties and there were some other details in there. It doesn't have clear goals regarding how much and what types of heritage should be covered in the community. It doesn't address or consider the impact on the community, whether it's individuals, families or areas. even though it's been done for the benefit of the community. In other words, things like costs, benefits, stresses, impositions, time, and so forth. It doesn't articulate the goals of heritage protection in the future, nor does it delineate between the often conflated heritage and neighbourhood character issues. It doesn't address whether the original goals or their priorities were correct, whether resources spent on gap studies to protect essentially protecting facades and significant properties versus, say, public infrastructure conservation. Unfortunately, I think some of the work was done in secret, for want of a better word, and resulted in a competitive process with some of the community, which we've seen play out in meetings here, which I think is really unfortunate. Hence, I'd like to see some of those items addressed, in addition to opening up the Heritage Advisory Committee to include members of the community, like with other communities, and or perhaps be completely open, and create a strategy and hence policies that are less contentious and divisive than what we've seen in the past. I think as a priority item, we need to focus on time-sensitive information gathering. There are elderly people living in my area that know that have lived there their entire lives. They know the backgrounds of these things, and we've been focusing on what's found in newspapers or existing sources. I think we need to capture information before this is lost from the community. So I'm concerned that by passing item 2 of the recommendations, that it may not alter the trajectory needed. Can it be deferred pending public consultation and feedback regarding goals and objectives needed for a heritage strategy? And that's it, thanks.
Thank you, Mr Price, for your presentation. Councillors, are there any questions of Mr Price this evening? There appears to be none, so thank you for your presentation.
Thanks.
Our next presenter this evening is Ms Jane Oldham. If you can come forward, Ms Oldham. And just so that you're prepared, the presenter afterwards, Ms Nerida Muirden. Good evening, Ms Oldham. If you can commence with your name and your suburb, followed by your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
Good evening, Jane Oldham from Camberwell. In speaking in support of the resolutions, I would like to start by acknowledging the thorough and well thought out review paper before you tonight. Councillors, thank you for enabling the executive officers to recruit dedicated heritage planners, and both are warmly welcomed. The fact that Boroondara's community plan reflects the value that Boroondara community places on its heritage and neighbourhood character is often referred to in this chamber. As you consider the paper tonight and its recommendations, it's useful to also see them in the context of the Planning and Environment Act. Under Section 4 of the Act, every local council is required to continually identify, conserve and enhance places of local heritage significance. Like housework, that work is never done. A heritage strategy is the logical next step to guide council's planning and decision-making for heritage work. Not only is strategy best practice amongst heritage-rich municipalities, and an expectation of the Heritage Victoria, it will enable councillors, officers and community expectations to be better aligned and managed. When doing that strategy work, I would encourage you to consider use of neighbourhood character provisions to maintain the character of places that are not eligible for inclusion in the heritage overlay, but are worth retaining. Activities Council invests in that increase both Boroondara's community knowledge and celebration of its heritage and the values those places represent ought to make Council's duty to protect and conserve heritage easier. With good promotion, heritage will bring visitors to Boroondara, just like heritage attracts visitors the world over. What we have is unique. Across Melbourne, there are councils with programs and festivities that celebrate their local heritage for Boroondara to draw upon. The paper identifies the private gardens, outdoor spaces and built structures that are neither homes nor commercial from the Victorian to interwar areas remain as gaps in Boroondara's heritage overlay. Modern architecture is yet to be widely explored, but there are places of value at risk as Melbourne addresses its housing crisis. With the increased resources within strategic planning and the gap studies almost completed, I hope councillors have the comfort that other important work won't be sacrificed by the officer's recommendations being approved tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Ms Oldham. Councillors, are there any questions for Ms Oldham this evening? There appears to be none, so you may return to the gallery. Thank you again. Our third presenter this evening is Ms Nerida Muirden, if you can come forward, and followed by Mr Andrew Nunn. Good evening, Ms Muirden. If we can commence with your name and your suburb and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Nerida Muirden and I'm from Camberwell. Good evening, councillors and officers. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I and the Burundara Heritage Group Committee would like to strongly support the motion tonight. In particular, the proposed development of a long-term strategy seems to be a most important activity for the city to develop. As we all know, Burundara is one of the most heritage-rich cities within metropolitan Melbourne, with the most wonderful historic heritage architecture. As such, we think we as a community have a responsibility to the whole of Melbourne and Victoria to do our utmost to conserve our heritage and to help grow the appreciation and understanding of it by both the local community and visitors. The heritage buildings in our city could one day become a key driver of reasons to visit the city and could help support our local economy. Most importantly, the development of a long-term strategic plan for our heritage places is in reality the only way to ensure a best practice approach to the conservation of our local heritage for the next 100 years. We are not protecting our heritage places for the short term, so therefore we need long-term plans that meet the same timeframes if we are to ensure the activities and resources required. Most other heritage-rich municipalities, such as the cities of Melbourne, Stonington and Yarra, already have these strategic plans. Regional cities such as Bendigo and Ballarat also. The State Planning Department and the Heritage Council recommend that all councils prepare these heritage strategies, and we will therefore be bringing up our own city up to date with this activity. It will provide the community and heritage owners greater certainty and greater support. It will also enable greater pleasure and well-being that is derived by communities around the world from the appreciation and sharing of their heritage and historic places. We hope councillors will vote to support the development of this long-term heritage strategy. Anyway, thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you for your presentation. Ms Muirden, that was had almost a minute to go.
Okay.
That's good. Councillors, any questions for Ms Muirden this evening? There appears to be none. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is Mr Andrew Nunn, if you can come forward, and after Mr Nunn, Ms Robin Kelly. Thank you, Mr Nunn. If we can commence with your name, your suburb.
Andrew Nunn, Hawthorn.
3 minutes.
Thank you, councillors and the officers attending. Both those reports tonight are expansive, lots of work. And fortunately, my 2 previous speakers have expressed what I was going to say. So I'd just like to concentrate on page 18, 6.1, key future implications. Targeted heritage identification and protection. You can read the paragraphs there. I'd put that quite simply that there's a bit of unfinished business, obviously, here. And maybe it's important to scope that because I don't think it should be forgotten. I'll talk about Wattle Road. We would not be in the mess we're in now if we had have thought about Wattle Road 10 years ago, and we still haven't finished the study of Wattle Road after 2 years. We, as the community, have commissioned one study and probably another, and we've had a developer's picnic and loss of heritage. Now, that's an example, but I think it's important not to drop the ball on some of these projects, albeit they difficult. And I do recognise the vagaries of DWELP and developers and all the pressures that are on planning departments. I also think cost. There's a cost to not doing things, and I think that's probably what we've been seeing in some of these cases. And I do fully agree with this report in its concept, and I thank the Mayor and the current councillors for progressing this to this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Nunn, for your presentation. There doesn't appear to be any lights. You may return to the gallery, so thank you for that. Our last presenter this evening is Ms Robin Kelly, if you can come forward. Again, Ms Kelly, if we can just commence with your name and your suburb, followed by your 3-minute presentation.
Could I have the photo up, please, that I gave? Thank you. My name is Robin Kelly, and 2A Careep Road, Balwyn. Thank you. I wanted to have that up while I'm speaking. Probably the oldest farmhouse in Burundara at 192 Doncaster Road at the Doncaster tram terminus behind a high fence, 1856, built of Warrandyte stone. I've had to stand up at auctions in the last 2 or 3 years when this is up for sale, not saying that it's heritage protected in 2019. Thank you all for heritage protecting and passing this in 2019 through the Balwyn Historical Society, together with the Balwyn Cinema. It is sitting there. The auctioneers do not say that it's heritage protected, and when I ask, they say they don't know. And then I tell them, and then all hell breaks loose, and all the people that thought they could demolish it get very upset. So I think there should be more stringent things about declaring at auctions that something is heritage protected. I'd like to thank you all for your efforts. I know a lot of you do live in beautiful old houses like I did, and I thank you very much for this new approach. And I think it's fantastic, and I think there should be a lot more people here tonight. I only knew about it because I saw the ad in The Age in the back during the week. But I was at all 3 historical society meetings this week and wasn't mentioned once. And there's not, there's a lot of people I rang. Mary Dross just received a text today. She couldn't come, unwell. But a lot of people did not know about this. James Nicholas, Laurie Butner, lots of people. So please, there should be something we sign when we come into these meetings with phone numbers that a year ago when it was shut down, we cancelled the meeting at the beginning, that we should all be contacted again. Anything to do with heritage, I suggest, because, you know, we really want to be here. So thank you, and thank you very much for your continuing work with heritage. I agree with what you're trying to do to improve things, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms Kelly, for your presentation. Councillors, are there any questions for Ms Kelly? There appears to be none. Thank you.
I just request someone try and buy this beautiful, rare farmhouse, please, for a couple of million, because it's in a fabulous spot for all the school buses to pull up and the coffee.
Thank you, Ms Kelly. You may
trucks
return to the gallery. Thank you.
And try and go in it. 1856, 20 years after Batman.
Thank you, Ms Kelly.
Wow.
We're going to turn to matters arising. Back to our officers. Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. Thank you to all the supportive comments for those who've come in support of the strategy. We really appreciate those, and they are noted. In terms of comments that were more constructive, I'd like to start with addressing Mr Price's comments. So the review, the Heritage Action Plan review, is essentially an internal assessment of the action plan items. So the action plan is an itemised list, so the responses to those items, whether or not they've been actioned or not, is actually fairly binary. So consulting with internal departments allowed us to determine whether those items had been delivered. So we believe that was the right course of action to sort of grasp to what extent that report, or to what extent the items on that Heritage Action Plan 2016 had been attended to. For items which weren't actioned or ongoing or still relevant, which are listed in the report, in the agenda, they can be integrated into a future heritage strategy. So they're not being ticked off and just sort of cast aside. They are things that we're looking at continuing as part of a future strategy as relevant. Future heritage needs and community consultation is a process that we undergo as part of the development of a future heritage strategy. So that will all be looked at as part of the development of that strategy moving forward. That's when we'll be looking at all community stakeholders, internal, external, etc. So community consultation wasn't really necessary for the HAP 2016 review. This was an internal document that we were looking at drafting up. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr Dixon. Councillors, are there any questions of officers? Councillor Franco.
Thank you, Chair. A question of clarification and what's meant in the report. The report is drafted saying the heritage gap studies are all complete, all the work's done. And look, that may be the case, but how does that reconcile with the current work that's still ongoing in Glen Iris, the Mon Iris estate, Ashburton, as one of the councillors, along with our acting chair today, where we've got work that's underway, people still making submissions and representations. I find it a little bit hard to genuinely read and interpret the words, the work was all complete in 2022, when I know work needs to come back. And maybe it'd be good to understand that.
I think the officers can respond to that.
Certainly, thank you, through you, Chair. The gap study itself has been finalised, so the final volume of the gap study for Glen Iris was gazetted, but there were, my understanding, this predates my appointment to council, but my understanding is that there were certain precincts and certain heritage places that were identified as part of the gap study that sometimes were set aside from the gap study for practical reasons, and they're still being attended to some degree as an ongoing sort of case, a case-by-case basis, but generally speaking, the gap study volumes themselves, what was left of those volumes, have been gazetted and finalised. So there'll always be heritage places which may come back and forth and be considered that may have a sort of more contentious history, which may come back, you know, in different ways. But the gap study is finalised. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Does that answer your question, Councillor?
Well, in a way, yes. I mean, the work is ongoing, and I think it's a product thereof, basically.
The Mont Iris estate, in particular, is coming back for reconsideration because it was truncated at the planning panel level.
Yep. Yes.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I would like to foreshadow a motion at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you. Duly noted. Any further questions from councillors? On that note, Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you. And look, I'd like to begin by thanking Mr Dixon and Mr Cowan. And sorry, I will just say that I want to support the officer's recommendation, but I just wanted to thank them for their comments.
Thank you. We'll get a seconder, which we have now got. It's not Councillor Park, it's our Madam Mayor, Councillor Sinfield. So as the mover, would you like to speak to your motion? Oh, actually, is there any opposition? There appears to be no opposition, so you may speak to your motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Look, as the current chair of the Heritage Advisory Committee, and I'm joined here today by the Mayor, Councillor Sinfield, Councillor Gillies, and unfortunately Councillor Stavrou is unable to join us tonight, but as members of the Heritage Advisory Committee, I'm delighted that this motion's been put here before us. Tonight we reach a milestone. The Heritage Action Plan 2016 has been on the to-do list for some time, and it is a very important piece of work, and I'm pleased now that as it becomes to completion, with the gap studies, as just raised by Councillor Franco, going through the cycle, that now is the appropriate time to consider the ongoing heritage issues within our precinct. The Heritage Action Plan has given rise to the municipal-wide Heritage Gap Study program undertaken by Council from 2016 to 2020, resulting in the projection and inclusion of over 5,000 additional properties through heritage overlay. So with this motion, I'm pleased to move the endorsement of the Heritage Action Plan Review Report and encourage my councillor colleagues to support this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. As this motion is unopposed, I'll put the motion to the vote. All those in favour? I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors, and thank you, presenters. I will move to general business, and Councillor Hollingsworth, you have an item of general business.
I do, thank you. Just bear with me for one moment. Following last week's Services Delegated Committee meeting, there was a matter raised on the agenda with regard to the Mailing Road streetscape option 1 or option 2 scenarios put before us. Now,
I just wish to clarify what I had intended to say at the end of my closing comments. Unfortunately, due to time constraints and a very tight agenda, I was sort of cut off towards the end of my final words, and my comments with regard to option 1, where I stated that I was aware of Susie Q Lingerie and Ruby 2 Teas Cafe, hearing their support for option 1. Now, I just wanted to validate that I was at a community consultation meeting and I actually heard them say that they were supportive of option 1. I then went on to say, and Between Us Cafe and others, and that's where I was unfortunately no longer able to continue because my time had expired. But what I wanted to say at that point was that I had the opportunity to serve with Councillor Addis on the steering committee for the Mailing Road Place Plan. During that time on the steering committee, we were involved in various meetings and reviews with the officers that were on that committee. My understanding was that Between Us, Chapter 3 Cafe, who had several connecting businesses there, and one other, were supportive of the place plan. They were supportive of the laneway activation. And one of the concerns raised during consultation that they did not want to lose any of the car parking opportunities at the front of their businesses. So I believe option 1 delivered that and addressed the concerns, but I now acknowledge that Between Us, the proprietor, made it quite clear after the meeting that she did not support option 1. So I want to acknowledge that. I wasn't trying to put words into anyone's mouth. It was just, of my understanding, I believe there was a level of support for option 1. I also just wanted to make comment that during the course of the week, there has been some emails and innuendo implied that there wasn't due process done during this consultation, and I just want to make it clear that it's been a very comprehensive process. All councillors and officers involved have invested considerable time, and I understand that some people did not support option 1, but that was what's supported by council, and I believe that due diligence has taken place. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. For the benefit of councillors, I gave discretion to allow Councillor Hollingsworth just to clear the slate with regards to quite a stressful week in response to the decision that was made by council last week. Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. Councillors, are there any further items of general business? There appears to be none. Any items of urgent business? There are no items of urgent business. Confidential business? There being no items of confidential business, therefore, before I close the meeting, I'd like to thank all of our presenters that have presented this evening, and for those of you who've joined online, thank you for joining us. I declare the Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting closed at 7:30. Thank you, Gallery. Thank you, councillors.